The day of the funeral had arrived, and the heavy sadness that hung in the air was impossible to ignore. David stood by the casket, his heart aching as he watched his mother's body laid to rest. He couldn't believe she was really gone. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream. The people who had come to pay their respects surrounded him, their faces somber, eyes filled with grief. Some were distant relatives, others close friends of the family. They all shared the same pain, but they showed it in different ways. Some whispered quietly amongst themselves, while others wiped tears away as they stared at the casket. David stood tall but felt small in that moment, his mind overwhelmed by the thought that his mother was no longer there. He tried to keep it together, to show his family that he was okay. But deep down, he was struggling. As he scanned the room, he noticed his daughter, Sarah, sitting quietly in the front row beside him. At only 10 years old, she seemed out of place among all the adults, yet she wasn't just a kid here. She had always been mature for her age, her intelligence sharp and her curiosity endless. Today, though, she seemed distant, her gaze drifting off into the casket at the front of the room. Every now and then, she would glance around the room, as if searching for something. David couldn't help but notice that Sarah wasn't crying like the others. She wasn't talking to anyone either. There was something different about her today. She seemed more solemn than usual, as though she was holding something inside, something that was weighing heavily on her. He reached over and gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder, trying to comfort her without saying a word. She didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she just didn't respond in the way he had hoped. As the priest began the eulogy, talking about his mother's life and all the good she had done, Sarah shifted in her seat. She looked up at David with wide eyes, her expression serious. "Dad," she whispered, tugging gently on his sleeve. David turned to her, expecting her to ask for something simple, like a drink of water or to go to the bathroom. Instead, Sarah's eyes were fixed on him, and her voice was low, almost like a secret she couldn't hold in any longer. "Grandma's hiding something," Sarah said quietly, almost as though she didn't want anyone to hear. Her words were strange, and they immediately caught David off guard. He gave her a gentle smile, brushing off her comment, thinking it was just a child's imagination, a fleeting thought that would pass. "What do you mean, honey?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation light, hoping to distract her. Sarah didn't respond right away. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, as if weighing something in her mind. "Grandma told me things that I can't forget," she murmured, her eyes never leaving his. David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had never heard Sarah speak like this before. It wasn't like her to bring up something so serious, especially in the middle of a funeral. The priest's voice continued in the background, but David couldn't focus on the words anymore. His attention was entirely on his daughter. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing around the room. "She said there were secrets, big secrets, and she told me I wasn't supposed to tell anyone," Sarah added, her voice barely above a whisper. David looked at her, unsure of how to react. He was starting to feel uneasy. The weight of her words hung in the air, and his mind began to race, trying to make sense of it all. Could this be a child's fantasy, or was there more to it than that? David gently squeezed her hand, attempting to reassure her without giving away how unsettled he felt. But Sarah wasn't finished. She was too focused, too certain of what she had said, and David couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He tried to calm her down, telling her everything would be okay, but deep inside, his mind couldn't help but wonder. Was there really something Sarah knew about his mother that no one else did? As the funeral continued, the air felt thick with tension. David tried his best to focus on the ceremony, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. She wasn't acting like her usual self. Normally, Sarah would be sitting still, listening carefully to what was being said, but today, she was almost fidgeting in her seat. Every so often, she would glance around the room, her eyes scanning the people gathered, as though she was looking for something or someone. David couldn't help but feel uneasy. He had heard children say strange things before, things that didn't always make sense. But Sarah wasn't just speaking in riddles or asking innocent questions. Her words carried weight, something more serious than David was used to hearing from his young daughter. The fact that she was so focused, so intent on her words, made David question whether this was more than just a passing thought. When Sarah had spoken earlier, her voice had been quiet but firm. "Grandma's hiding something." The words still echoed in David's mind. It was not like Sarah to say things like that. She had always been a perceptive child. But this felt different. His mother had been a loving, kind woman. How could Sarah possibly know anything that would make her grandmother seem like she was hiding something? David glanced down at Sarah, who was now staring at the ground, her small fingers tightly gripping the edge of the seat. Her eyes were wide, and she seemed lost in her own thoughts. David took a deep breath, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to hear what Sarah might say next, and yet the question loomed in his mind. What was going on? What did Sarah really know? As the service continued, David tried to focus on the priest's words. But Sarah wasn't finished. After a long moment of silence, she spoke again, her voice barely audible above the hum of the ceremony. "She told me not to tell anyone. She said it's dangerous. But I have to tell you, Dad," she said, looking up at him with an expression that made David's heart skip a beat. There was a mixture of fear and determination in her eyes, something he had never seen before. David leaned in closer, lowering his voice to match hers. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, even though his nerves were beginning to fray. He could feel the tension building inside him. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a little girl's imagination anymore. Sarah swallowed hard, and for a moment, she hesitated. It was clear that whatever she was about to say was something that weighed heavily on her. Then, in a voice so quiet that only David could hear, she whispered, "Grandma said that she wasn't supposed to be here. That something bad was going to happen if anyone found out." David's heart began to race. What was she talking about? His mind struggled to make sense of Sarah's words, but the more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. His mother had never mentioned anything like this. She had been a private person, but she was never one to keep dangerous secrets, or so David had thought. What if this was some sort of mistake? What if Sarah had overheard something, misunderstood it, or even dreamed it? But as David looked into Sarah's eyes, he saw a certainty there that he couldn't ignore. It was as though she truly believed every word she was saying. He felt a wave of confusion wash over him. What could be so dangerous? What was it that his mother had been hiding? And why was Sarah the one to uncover it? Before David could process what Sarah had just said, there was a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The room had grown quieter, and people were starting to glance around. Sensing the unease that had taken hold, David felt the weight of the moment, the strange feeling that something was about to unravel, something he wasn't prepared for. But whatever it was, he knew one thing for certain. Sarah had just opened a door that would change everything. The tension in the room grew thicker as Sarah's words hung in the air. David sat frozen, trying to process what she had just said. His heart beat faster, and his mind raced with questions. But before he could gather his thoughts, Sarah continued to fidget in her seat. It was clear that she wasn't finished, and neither was her unsettling message. David could see the confusion and worry in the eyes of the people around them. The murmurs had started, and the conversations around the room became quieter as they noticed the shift in the mood. Sarah wasn't acting like herself, and that made everyone uneasy. The calm, composed little girl they all knew was now distant and tense, her expression serious and troubled. As the priest continued with the service, David tried to pay attention, but his mind was preoccupied with his daughter's strange behavior. He kept glancing at her, wondering if he had missed something important. Maybe she had overheard something, a conversation, a rumor, and misinterpreted it. Maybe it was just a child's confusion or imagination. But then, looking at Sarah's face again, David couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, almost nervously, as if she was scanning the crowd for something. Her hands twisted in her lap, her fingers playing with the hem of her dress. David leaned closer, trying to catch her attention. "Sarah," he whispered gently, "what do you mean? What exactly did Grandma tell you?" She didn't answer right away, her lips pressing together in a tight line. Then, as though trying to put the pieces of her thoughts into words, she whispered, "Grandma told me that if anyone found out what she did, they would come after her. She said there were things we didn't know about. Dangerous things." David felt a cold chill run down his spine. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of Sarah's words. What could his mother have done that was so dangerous? She had been a kind woman, a loving mother and grandmother. She had never been involved in anything harmful or unlawful, at least not as far as David knew. The idea that she might have been hiding something so dark and dangerous seemed impossible. "Sarah, honey," David said quietly, trying to keep his voice calm despite the rising panic inside him. "What exactly are you talking about? What did Grandma do?" But Sarah wasn't ready to explain further. She just shook her head, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "I don't know, Dad," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't want me to know. But she said I had to tell you. She said it was important, that something bad was going to happen." David's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? Why would his mother have kept such a secret from the family? And why was Sarah the one to find out about it? He felt a growing sense of urgency, as if time was running out, and something was slipping through his fingers, something he couldn't grasp. Before David could say anything more, Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and determination. "I'm scared, Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I think Grandma knew something was going to happen. Something bad. And now I think it's starting." David swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. His mind was spinning with thoughts, but he had to stay calm. He couldn't let the panic take over. Not now. Not with everything at stake. He glanced around the room, noticing the growing whispers among the guests. He could feel their eyes on him, and he knew that something had to be done. The sense of unease was palpable, and David didn't know what to make of it. Was this just a child's wild imagination, or was there something much more serious going on? With Sarah's words still echoing in his mind, David knew that he had to get to the bottom of it. But how? How could he even begin to make sense of the strange message his daughter had delivered? And more importantly, what danger was his family really in? The air in the room seemed to crackle with tension. David felt like he was stuck in a moment where everything was moving in slow motion. His mind was still reeling from Sarah's unsettling words. "Something bad is going to happen," she had said. What could she mean by that? His mother had never mentioned anything like this before. There had never been any hint of danger, no signs of secrets being hidden. Everything had always seemed so ordinary, so normal. But now, everything felt different. As the priest continued to speak, his words barely registered in David's mind. He was far too distracted by the whirlwind of thoughts that spun in his head. He glanced down at Sarah, who was now staring at the floor, her hands tightly clutching her dress. She looked so small and fragile, but there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself. She knew something. David could feel it in his bones. She had seen or heard something that no one else had. But what was it? David couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was just out of his reach, like a puzzle with one missing piece. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to find them. The only person who could have provided clarity, his mother, was gone. And Sarah, despite being just a child, seemed to have some knowledge about something hidden in their family's past. "Dad, I think it's starting," Sarah had whispered earlier, her voice trembling with fear. The words repeated in his mind, growing louder with each passing second. What did she mean? What was starting? Was there something about his mother's life that he hadn't known? Something she had kept from the family? something dangerous. David's heart began to race. The longer he sat there, trying to make sense of it all, the more he realized how little he actually knew about his mother's life outside of what she had shared with him. They had always had a close relationship, but his mother had been a private person, often choosing not to talk about things she deemed unnecessary or uncomfortable. Had she been hiding something all along? Was there something she had been running from? Sarah shifted in her seat beside him, her gaze still fixed on the floor. David gently placed his hand on her shoulder, trying to offer comfort. But his mind was a storm of questions, and he could tell by the look on his daughter's face that she wasn't going to be satisfied with anything less than the truth. She knew something was wrong, and as much as he wanted to brush it off as a child's imagination, part of him couldn't ignore the seriousness in her tone. Suddenly, Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with urgency. "Dad, we have to find out what happened. We can't just ignore it," she said, her voice more serious than ever. Her words hit him like a wave. She was right. They couldn't just move on. Not after what she had said. He needed to know what his mother had been hiding, and why it had taken his daughter to reveal it. David looked around the room, the weight of the situation settling in. People were still talking in hushed tones, glancing nervously between each other, but David was lost in his thoughts. He could feel the eyes of his family members on him, but they weren't his focus. His focus was on Sarah and the dark path she had just opened up. There were no more excuses. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. "Sarah," he whispered, leaning in closer, "what do you think is going to happen? What do you think Grandma was afraid of?" She looked at him, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. "I don't know, Dad, but I think it has to do with the things she told me. She said I'd be the one to find out, that I was supposed to tell you." David felt his chest tighten. What could it be? What had his mother been so scared of? Was this about something in the past, something buried so deep that no one even knew about it? Or was it something recent, something that had started long before Sarah had even spoken those strange words? For the first time since the funeral had begun, David felt like he had to act. The truth was out there, and he was going to find it, no matter where it took him. The room seemed to close in on David as the minutes ticked by. The priest's words blurred into the background as his thoughts spiraled. He couldn't get Sarah's words out of his head. Something bad is going to happen. What was it? What did his mother know? And why was Sarah the one who had to carry this burden, revealing it to him in such a strange and unsettling way? David looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of the other family members. The whispers were growing louder now, a mix of concern and confusion, but no one seemed to know what was going on. No one except Sarah. She had said she was scared. And when a child is scared, it means something. It meant that whatever she was talking about was real, or at least felt real to her. He couldn't dismiss it anymore. David cleared his throat and stood up, motioning for Sarah to follow him. They needed to step away from the crowd. Something about the weight of the room, filled with mourners and silent judgments, was making it harder to think clearly. The funeral had turned into something more like an interrogation, with eyes constantly glancing over to where they were sitting. David wanted space, wanted time to talk to Sarah without anyone else looking over their shoulders. They made their way to a quiet corner of the funeral home, away from the prying eyes. The soft murmur of voices and the rustling of people shifting seats in the main room still echoed in the distance. But here, in the corner, there was a rare moment of peace. David looked down at his daughter, who still had her head slightly lowered. Her hands were clasped tightly together in front of her. She looked like she was carrying the weight of the world, and David hated that she had to bear it alone. "Sarah, please tell me everything you know," David asked gently, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't want to scare her, but he needed to understand what she had uncovered, what his mother had kept hidden. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her small fingers twisting around each other nervously. "I don't know, Dad. Grandma said it was a secret, and she told me not to tell anyone. But then she said I had to. She said it was important." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. But it doesn't make sense. I don't know what to do. David's heart ached for her. How could he explain to her that what she was saying wasn't just something that would pass? It wasn't a childish game. It felt too real, too serious. And yet, how could he possibly explain this to anyone else without sounding like he was imagining things? Everyone was grieving. He couldn't add more confusion to the situation. "Okay, honey," David said softly, crouching down so they were eye level. "I need you to think very carefully. What exactly did Grandma say? What secret did she have?" Sarah's brow furrowed as she tried to recall the conversation. She said it had to do with something that happened a long time ago. Something she did, but that no one knew about. She said it would hurt a lot of people if it came out. That's why she never told anyone. But then, she said it was time for it to come out. That's why she told me. David's mind raced. Something from the past. His mother had always been so careful, so private. She had never given any indication that there was something hidden in her life that could cause harm. But now, the more Sarah spoke, the more it sounded like a long-forgotten secret was finally being unearthed. David felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. Could this really be true? Was Sarah's grandmother hiding something that could change everything? He thought about his mother's past, her relationships, and the people she had known. But nothing stood out. Nothing that would make sense of Sarah's words. "I don't understand," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did Grandma tell you? Why not tell me? Why now?" Sarah's eyes filled with worry, and she spoke again, her voice trembling. "She said I would be the one to find out. That it would be me who had to tell you." She paused for a moment, then added, "And I think it's starting to happen." David felt a chill run through him. Sarah wasn't just repeating something she had heard. She was speaking with an unsettling certainty, like she knew something he didn't. "What's starting?" he asked, his voice strained. But Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked away, her eyes scanning the quiet corner, as if expecting something to happen. "I don't know," she finally whispered, "but I think it's happening now." David felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. What could his mother have been hiding? And why had it fallen to Sarah to carry this burden? He needed answers. He needed to find out what his mother had been so terrified to reveal before it was too late. David's mind was racing, and he could feel his heartbeat quicken with every passing second. He tried to steady himself, but the uncertainty of what was happening was too overwhelming. Sarah's words had struck him deeply. "I think it's happening now." What did she mean by that? What was starting? And why did his mother choose this moment, at her own funeral, to reveal these cryptic warnings through Sarah? The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. His mother had been a private person, but she had always seemed so composed, so in control of her life. Nothing had ever seemed out of place. He had always admired how well she kept her personal matters to herself. But now, as he looked into Sarah's eyes, everything seemed different. He could see the fear in her expression, the weight of something she felt compelled to share but didn't fully understand herself. David felt his chest tighten. There had to be a reason. His mother wasn't one to act irrationally. Whatever she had been keeping from the family, it must have been significant. And now, somehow, Sarah had become the messenger, the one to carry the burden of this secret. He glanced around, his eyes flicking nervously toward the other family members. They were still in the main room, moving about in a subdued manner, but the tension was palpable. He had no idea what they might be thinking, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been revealed today, it would change everything. "Dad," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. She had been looking around the corner, her eyes scanning the empty hallway. David noticed her unease. Her body was tense, her fingers once again twisting around the fabric of her dress. She seemed as if she was waiting for something she couldn't put into words. "I think they know." David's heart skipped a beat at her words. "Who knows, honey?" he asked, his voice filled with urgency, but he was trying his best to sound calm for Sarah's sake. "The people Grandma was scared of," Sarah answered quietly. She didn't need to say more for David to understand. His mind immediately went back to the things Sarah had said earlier. "Grandma told me that there were people she had to hide from," Sarah continued, her voice growing more anxious. "And she said that when I found out, it would be too late. But now, I don't think we have much time." David felt a wave of panic wash over him. He tried to keep his composure for Sarah, but the pieces weren't fitting together. Who were these people? And why had his mother been afraid of them? This was more than just a family secret. This was something deeper, something darker that had been buried for years, and now it seemed to be coming to the surface. "I don't understand," David said softly, his voice shaky. "Who are these people? What do they want?" Sarah shook her head, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I think they're coming for us. I think they're already here." David's heart pounded. He took a step back, feeling his thoughts race, but none of them made sense. His mind scrambled to come up with a reasonable explanation. Was it possible that Sarah was misinterpreting something? Could this all just be a misunderstanding? But the certainty in her eyes told him that she wasn't just guessing. She believed every word she said. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, breaking David from his thoughts. His head snapped toward the noise, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow moving just beyond the doorway. His pulse quickened. Was this it? Was someone really here? Someone connected to whatever secret his mother had been hiding? "Dad, I'm scared," Sarah said, her voice small. She was still clutching her dress, her body tense with fear. David didn't know what to say. He felt helpless. He had no idea what was really going on, but Sarah's fear felt so real. She was only a child. Why would she be so certain of something so serious if there wasn't some truth to it? With his mind racing, David turned back to Sarah and knelt down to her level. He needed to stay strong for her. "Listen to me, sweetheart," he said gently, trying to steady his breath. "We're going to figure this out. I promise you. We'll get to the bottom of this, okay?" Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with worry. "But what if it's already too late, Dad?" she whispered. David swallowed hard, his stomach tightening with fear. He didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know what was happening or what to do next. But one thing was certain. He couldn't ignore this. Whatever was starting, whatever was coming, it was only a matter of time before it reached them. David's mind was spinning as he stood in the quiet corner with Sarah. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, and his thoughts were racing. What had Sarah meant by "they're already here"? Who were these people? And what had his mother been involved in all those years ago that was suddenly coming to the surface? He didn't have any answers, but the unease in the pit of his stomach told him that whatever was happening, it was serious. He glanced at Sarah, her small face full of worry and confusion. She wasn't the same carefree girl he had known just a few days ago. The fear in her eyes was too real, too deep for it to be something trivial. She wasn't making this up. She wasn't playing a game. Sarah truly believed that something dangerous was coming, and David couldn't ignore that. "Sarah, listen to me," David said, his voice soft but firm. "We're going to get through this. I don't know what's going on yet, but we'll figure it out together. You're not alone." Sarah nodded, but David could tell she wasn't convinced. She still looked around nervously, her eyes darting to the shadows in the hallway. The tension in the air felt like it was suffocating them. He could almost hear his own thoughts louder than anything else. It was as if there was something lurking just beyond their reach, something they couldn't quite understand but knew was there. David didn't know how much time had passed, but he knew it was time to make a decision. He couldn't stay in this limbo any longer, not when Sarah was so scared. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. The longer they waited, the more the weight of the mystery pressed on them. "We need to talk to someone, Sarah," David said, standing up and gently taking her hand. "There has to be someone who knows something about all of this. someone who can help us understand what your grandmother was so afraid of." Sarah's face grew pale at the mention of talking to someone. "But who, Dad? Who would know? Grandma told me not to tell anyone. She said it was dangerous." David's heart ached seeing how much this was affecting Sarah. He had always tried to protect her, to shield her from the harshness of the world. But now, it seemed like the world had come crashing in. He couldn't protect her from this, but he could help her understand it. "I know, sweetheart," David said softly. "I don't want to put you in danger, but we need to know the truth. We need to find out what's really going on. We can't keep guessing forever." David's mind began to turn to the people in their lives who might know something. There had to be someone, maybe a close family friend, a distant relative who had known his mother better than he had. David thought back to the times when his mother had been vague or mysterious about certain things, but he had always dismissed them. Maybe he should have asked more questions, looked deeper. Now it was too late to ask his mother directly. The only option was to dig into her past, to uncover the secrets that she had kept buried. "Let's go home," David said, feeling the first sense of control in the chaos. "We'll start with the things Grandma left behind. Maybe we can find something that will make all of this make sense." Sarah looked up at him, her expression still anxious, but a hint of relief seemed to wash over her. She nodded, though the fear in her eyes didn't completely fade. David took a deep breath and led her toward the exit, his mind still racing. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he had no choice now. He had to find out what his mother had been hiding. He couldn't live with the uncertainty, not when Sarah was so scared. They made their way out of the funeral home and into the cool evening air. The world seemed unchanged outside, yet David couldn't shake the feeling that everything was different now. His mother's funeral had turned into something far more than a farewell. It had become a search for truth, for answers, and for protection. David had no idea where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was not going to let Sarah face whatever was coming alone. As they walked to the car, Sarah stayed close to him, her hand tightly gripping his. David looked at her, doing his best to offer a reassuring smile. But inside, his thoughts were a whirlwind of uncertainty. What was happening? What had his mother been involved in? And how far did this go? David and Sarah drove home in silence, the weight of the day pressing down on them both. Sarah sat quietly in the passenger seat, her eyes staring out of the window, lost in thought. David's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he tried to process everything that had happened. He had no answers, no clear direction, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't ignore Sarah's words. He couldn't let whatever his mother had been hiding remain a mystery. When they arrived home, David led Sarah inside, his mind still racing with questions. The house felt oddly empty without his mother's presence. It had always been warm and full of life when she was around, but now it seemed so quiet, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The house had been a place of comfort, but now it felt like a place of secrets waiting to be uncovered. David paused in the doorway to the living room, taking a deep breath. "Sarah, I need you to stay close to me," he said gently. "We're going to look through Grandma's things, but I need you to know that I'm here. You're not alone in this." Sarah nodded, but the worry was still evident in her eyes. She had been brave so far, but David knew she was scared. And he was scared too. The unknown was a terrifying thing, and they had just opened a door that neither of them was fully prepared to walk through. But there was no turning back now. Together, they began to go through the house. David started with his mother's desk in the study. The drawers were filled with old papers, books, and small trinkets. As he sifted through the papers, he tried to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. There had to be something here, some clue, some piece of evidence, that would explain what his mother had been so afraid of. Sarah stood by the door, watching him quietly. Her eyes were scanning the room, and David could sense that she was waiting for something, as though she could feel the answers were hidden somewhere nearby. He felt a pang of guilt. He had been so caught up in the busy rush of everyday life that he never bothered to ask his mother about the things she kept to herself. Now, with her gone, he was scrambling to uncover the truth she had kept from everyone, including him. David pulled open another drawer, this one filled with old photographs. He flipped through them quickly, recognizing family gatherings, holidays, and birthdays. But then, in the back of the drawer, something caught his eye. A small envelope, yellowed with age, was tucked away beneath the photos. He pulled it out carefully, his hands trembling slightly. It was addressed to no one in particular, just simply, "For the one who finds this." David's heart skipped a beat as he opened the envelope. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was familiar. It was his mother's, but the words were unlike anything he had ever read from her. "If you're reading this, then the time has come. The truth cannot remain buried any longer. It's all tied to the past, to the people I betrayed, and to the family I had to protect. I'm sorry for the burden I leave behind, but you must know everything, or it will destroy us all." David felt a chill run down his spine as he read the words again. Betrayal, family, the burden she spoke of. What had his mother been involved in that could be so dangerous, so significant, that she had hidden it from everyone, including him? "Dad." Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale. "What did it say? Did you find something?" David slowly looked at the letter in his hand, his mind racing. "I think we found part of the answer, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "But we need to keep going. We need to find out everything." As David and Sarah continued to search through the house, they uncovered more pieces of the puzzle, more letters, more photographs, and even a few documents that hinted at long-forgotten family secrets. But none of it was enough to give them the full picture. The deeper they dug, the more questions arose, and as the hours passed, David realized that they weren't just searching for answers. They were uncovering a legacy, a history that had been hidden away for years. As night fell, the house seemed darker, heavier. David knew they were on the edge of something important. Whatever his mother had been afraid of was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to face it. But for now, David and Sarah had each other, and together they would face whatever came next.